Hi everyone, it's Carissa. Welcome back for another knitting tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at the petal stitch, which I developed for my upcoming assigned pooling design, the Falling Blossoms cowl. If you're not familiar with assigned pooling, it uses a yarn that is predominantly one color, like this chocolate brown, with streaks of an accent color, like this corally pink. While the yarn is the background color, you'll work a background stitch, for example, garter stitch here. When the yarn changes to the accent color, you'll work a fancy stitch, like this petal stitch, which I named that because to me they remind me of flower petals. Let's look at how to make one. So the yarn is currently my background color, so I'm going to continue with my background stitch, garter stitch. I'm going to continue knitting until my yarn changes to my accent color. And there we are, my yarn is changing to pink. So I'm going to stop working in garter stitch, and my next stitch is going to be one of these petal stitches, like this one. I'm going to start by knitting the next stitch, but I will not drop it off the left-hand needle yet. I'll rotate my needle around and yarn over, and then I'll knit that same stitch again. So now I have 3 stitches on my right-hand needle. I'm going to repeat those 2 steps until I have 9 stitches on my right-hand needle. So I'll yarn over and knit the same stitch again, yarn over and knit the same stitch again, one more time, yarn over and knit that same stitch again. So now I have 9 loops on my right hand needle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Now I can finally drop that stitch off my left hand needle. My next step is to turn my work to the other side. I'm going to bring the yarn to the back between the needle tips to get ready to knit. And I'm going to bind off 8 of those 9 stitches. So I'll start by knitting the first stitch. I'll knit the second stitch, and I'll use my left hand needle to pull the first stitch up and over and off the right hand needle. So that's 1 stitch bound off. I'll knit the next stitch and then bind off number 2. Knit the next stitch, bind off 3. Knit, bind off 4. Knit, bind off 5. Knit, bind off 6. Knit, bind off 7. Knit, and bind off 8. So I have bound off 8 of my 9 stitches, and my yarn is changing back to the brown color. Now, if your accent color streaks in your yarn is longer than mine, then maybe you want to work your petal stitch up to 11 stitches or even 13. If your accent streak is shorter, then maybe you only need 7 stitches instead of 9. I encourage you to do some swatching and figure out what works best for your yarn. But for me, I worked up to 9 stitches, and then I bound off 8 of those 9. So you'll always want to bind off 1 fewer. Now that last stitch that's left on my right hand needle, I'm going to slip it back to my left hand needle. And then I will turn my work back to the right side. And I'll bring my yarn to the back of my work to continue knitting in a moment. Now we want that flower petal to be on the right side of the fabric with all of its friends. So I'm going to push that petal stitch to the front, to the right side of the fabric. And I'll just hold it in place with my thumb while I continue to knit the next stitch. And I'll switch back to garter stitch now that my yarn is the background color again. There's our completed petal on the right hand side of our fabric. Now let's look at how to make a petal stitch on a wrong side row. You can see here I'm looking at the wrong side of the fabric. The right side is on the back right now with all of the petals. So I'm going to work a petal, but I want it to be on the right side of the fabric still. Let's also look at how to make this petal if you hold the yarn in your right hand. So I'm going to continue knitting in garter stitch as long as my yarn is the background color. Get a few more stitches in before it changes to the pink. There we go. Now our yarn has changed to pink. So this next stitch here is going to be a petal. The petal itself is worked exactly the same way. We're going to knit that stitch, but do not drop it off the left hand needle yet. Work a yarn over the right hand needle and then knit that same stitch a second time. And again, we'll work another yarn over and knit that stitch again. Yarn over and knit it again. One more time, yarn over and knit the same stitch again. Now I can drop that old stitch off my left hand needle and we should have 9 stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stitches on my right hand needle. Now we'll turn our work to the other side. Have all of those 9 stitches, so I'm going to bind off 8 of them. Bring our yarn to the back to start knitting. We'll go ahead and knit the first stitch, knit the second stitch, and then use our left hand needle to bind off that first stitch by lifting it up and over and off the right hand needle. We'll knit the next stitch and then bind off number 2, knit the next stitch, bind off 3, knit, bind off 4, knit, bind off 5, knit, bind off 6, knit, bind off 7, knit, and bind off 8. And my yarn is changing back to the brown color. Excellent. So take that last stitch and put it back on my left hand needle, then turn my work to the wrong side of the fabric again. And now we will proceed with our garter stitch. So we want the petal to be on the right side of the fabric though. So before I proceed with the garter stitch, I need to push that petal to the right side of the fabric, which is the side away from me now. Now I can bring the yarn to the back to continue knitting. And I'll just use a spare finger here to hold that petal in place while I continue to knit the next few stitches. And now our completed petal on a wrong side row is actually pushed to the back, to the right side of the fabric. Now, since parts of our cowl are worked in the round, in order to maintain garter stitch, we're actually going to be purling every second round when we get to the part of the cowl that's worked in the round. So let's look at how to work a petal stitch on a purl round. We'll purl as long as our yarn is the background color. And as soon as it changes to pink, now we're ready to work a petal. I'll bring my yarn to the back to start knitting, and then I'll work the petal the same way that I have each time before. I will knit that stitch, but don't drop it off the left-hand needle yet. Yarn over and knit that stitch again. Yarn over, knit it again. Yarn over and again. Yarn over and knit it one more time. Now I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 stitches on my right hand needle. I can drop that left stitch off the needle, turn my work, bring my yarn to the back to start knitting, and I'm going to bind off 8 of those 9 stitches. So knit 1, knit 2, and bind off the first stitch, knit and bind off the second stitch, knit, bind off 3, knit, bind off 4, knit, bind off 5, knit, bind off 6, knit, bind off 7, knit, and bind off 8. My petal is complete. I will put that last stitch back on the left hand needle before I turn my work to the right side of the fabric again. And now, since I'm purling, I don't need to bring my yarn to the back, but I do need to push that petal to the front, to the right side of the fabric before I continue purling with my next stitch. And I'll purl a few more stitches. And there is our completed petal on a purl round. Now, if you ever find that you accidentally let a petal stay on the wrong side of the fabric instead of the right side, it's pretty easy to fix. There's going to be a little hole next to each petal stitch, so you can gently push that petal through to the right side of the fabric. And there you go, all better. Finally, we need to look at how to work a petal stitch during our bind off. Our bind off is all solid brown, so we don't want to interrupt that with a streak of pink. We do want to continue making petal stitches during our bind off round. So as long as the yarn is still our background color, we will proceed with a normal bind off. Just knit and then pass the previous stitch over the last one until our yarn changes color. And now we don't want to just knit that stitch and bind off the previous stitch. We actually want to make a petal stitch here and then bind off the previous. So I've already got my knit one. I'm going to yarn over, knit one, yarn over, knit one, yarn over, knit one, yarn over, and knit one. So I have all 9 of my stitches for my petal stitch. Drop that stitch off the left hand needle and turn my work. Bring the yarn to the back to start knitting, and I'm going to bind off 8 of those petal stitches. So I'm going to knit 1, knit 2, and bind off 1, knit, bind off 2, knit, bind off 3, knit, bind off 4, knit, bind off 5, knit, bind off 6, knit, bind off 7, knit, and bind off 8. I'll put that last stitch on my left needle again, turn my work, and now I can bind off that stitch that came before the petal stitch. So I can use my left hand needle to lift that up and over my petal stitch to bind that off. My petal stitch still needs to be pushed to the right side of the fabric before I continue with my bind off. So I'll knit the next stitch and bind off. Knit the next stitch and bind off. So anytime that the yarn is the background color, it'll just be a normal bind off. And there we go. We do have a little bit of pink on our bind off, but not too much. Most of it worked into that petal stitch. And there you go, petal stitch on the bind off. Thanks so much for watching.